Bueno, bienvenidos a todos, a todas. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Voy a hacer una pequeña introducción en inglés sobre Laura Rival, aunque creo que ya muchos de nosotros la conocemos. Bueno, Laura Rival is a social anthropologist and professor of anthropology and development at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on Amazonian societies, environmental knowledge, and multi-species relations. She has carried out extensive long-term ethnographies in the fieldwork of Guarani people of Ecuador, where she has produced some of the most influential studies on the history, territoriality, and cosmology of Guarani people. A distinctive aspect of rival scholarship is her emphasis on plant as active agents in social life through her analysis of forest, horticulture, plant, human coevolution, and the ecological imagination of indigenous people. She has contributed significantly to contemporary debates in environmental anthropology, political ecology, and the anthropology of nature. Some of the important works of Laura is including the Waurani transformation in the 21st century, trekking through history, the Waurani of Amazonian in Ecuador, the social life of trees, anthropology perspective on tree symbolism, as well as numerous articles on Amazonian perspectivism, multispecies ethnography, and indigenous environmental knowledge. Her writing highlights how forest, plant, and human communities co-produce sociality, memory, and history. Well, I will pass the floor to Laura, but I have to say that Patricia just shared the link of the article that we will award in this session. So if you want to review the photographies or the main argument, you can go to this link. Thank you, Laura, for being with us, and thank you all the people that is present in this session. We will start with Laura.
Boa tarde, buenos días. Muchísimas gracias por invitarme. Es un gran placer de estar con ustedes. Realmente me gustan estas conversaciones. Necesitamos muchas de ellos, de estas conversaciones, creo, en este momento muy difícil de la historia humana. Y me disculpo muchísimo de hablar en inglés, pero así creo que yo puedo hablar con más nuances de cosas que son realmente bastante difíciles de escribir y analizar de una perspectiva antropológica. So what I want to say is that basically from that article, I'm going to focus on the ethnography, not on the analyses to start with, because I think that's what will allow us to enrich our discussions more. For me, the beauty of ethnography is precisely the fact that you can discuss it at any point in time almost. And if it stands out, if it stands for itself, it can be revised, it can be reinterpreted. It is open to that. A good ethnography requires reinterpretation, I would say. To me, this is very much what Marilyn Straven has spent her whole life, her whole career to insist upon. That interpretations are always provisional, that it is useful to consider the ethnography as something that can be revisited at any point in time. And this is why in my references on this article, I put this Lien and Paulson article. I thought it was very, it was a really good intervention from their part because possibly in the new interdisciplinary fields in which anthropology gets caught up at the moment, this is not valued or it's not even really understood. So when Lear and Palson say other than human has never been absent from anthropological accounts, that anthropology's classic holistic approach to social life has always been attentive to multi-species entanglements. It's always, albeit implicitly, embraced a notion of community in which interspecies relations matter. So to me, that makes the engagement of anthropology with STS or environmental humanities interesting in a different way. It's not that it was not there in anthropology, is that STS, environmental humanities, all these new upcoming fields around the post-human, etc., make it visible in different ways. And I am really fascinated by that. You know, it's like a different generation of scholarship as well. So how do the two complement each other? So what is really at the center of that article is the question, can a multi-species anthropology renew historical anthropology and resolve the numerous epistemic tensions that have kept natural, environmental, economic, labor, social, and more histories apart? So obviously we know that um, history is a very complex discipline. It might be breaking down. The interesting thing is that biology might be seen to be more breaking down in the light of technological innovation, in the light of all the work done in STS in particular. But there hasn't been really enough engagement with history. And definitely from the beginning, with the work of Bill Ballet, trying to create that paradigm of historical ecology was really to try to do that, like what on earth is history? How do you encounter history when you take into account all these different dimensions? So that's the question that I was really trying to grapple with in this article. So um, yes, so for me, writing this was very difficult. It took me a long time to write it, but it was such an interesting exercise. And I don't think I would have been able to do it without reading you, a younger generation. I can see Joanna is here. Hello, Joanna. Or a lot of younger scholars who went into this field and really tried to understand indigenous knowledge by bringing innovatively different kinds of anthropology, different kinds of social sciences, different interrogation of what is nature from an anthropological perspective. So when I decided that my chair should be the chair of anthropology of nature, society, and development. And by the way, that is quite characteristic of my scholarship. I really feel that's what it is, but nobody agrees in Oxford. They keep saying it's no, you're doing anthropology and development. And they've never accepted that this anthropology of development is an anthropology of nature and society. That makes me laugh. But it is all of that at the same time. For me, you cannot distinguish the three throngs, if you wish, because we are talking about human history. Human history, human agency, to me, will always have that kind of particular quality um, that needs to be apprehended dialectically. And it's very important to get all these multi-species discussions at the moment, and you trying to show the agencies of non-humans, because then we have something very dialectical at work there. How does his story change? How is it unfolding, especially in Amazonia today, which has such an important geopolitical presence as well? So those are just preliminary remarks. And just to give you a guess, a sense of what I was trying to do with the narrative, I'm just going to read that little ethnographic snippet, which in fact is not an ethnographic snippet. And this is what methodologically I found so interesting with the piece, is that normally, like any good classic anthropologist, I have my field notes, I have my diaries, I keep them for years. Obviously, they are there like sacred, documents, and I can go back to them. So it's all written at the time when I was doing the research, but there, not at all, because I wasn't planning to do research on this. You see, I wasn't at all planning to do research on this. So it's based on memory and it's based on intersubjective memory partially because I could not reconstruct the full intersubjectivity with all the key actors that were involved, but just me and one of my um, key co-researcher, who I call Omari, Emanuela Ima, is a name under which is more often known in Ecuador, but her Guarani name is Omari. The journey from the community center, where we had spent several days studying the participatory conservation management plan, had taken longer than expected. Omari did not seem to mind, though. She was relishing the boat trip up the Rio Negro, through the mangroves, studying everything around her. The color and temperature of the water, the birds flying, the sun's position, the currents and countercurrents. She jerked happy and laughing when a fish suddenly caused the surface of the water to shimmer. She must have been scrutinizing the river for river life. Omari had arrived in Manaus nearly 3 weeks earlier, and the superlative dimensions of everything in the state of Amazonas was no longer astonishing her. Manaus' dense population, the size of the fishes in the market, the vastness of the rivers, or the long distances covered thanks to various motorized forms of transport, including the boat where we slept for 2 nights, a first for her. All this aggrandizement was now part of the ordinary, the to be expected. When she saw a motorbike assembly factory next to our hotel, that was in Manaus, with hundreds of bikes neatly aligned row after row, Omari simply remarked that she should get one to cover the journey between her home in Shelmera and her office in Puyo, a much more convenient and cheaper way of traveling than by bus. In the Rio Negro community, we had stayed with a young family actively involved in the large conservation program we had come to study. Omari had made friends with a wife, Armenia, who was at least 10 years younger than her. Armenia had cooked for us, while her husband had spent time explaining the conservation rules, the payments, the conditional cash transfers, and more. We had managed communicating across the linguistic divide, Portuguese and Spanish, pretty well. It was time, Armenia thought, to invite us to visit her parents. They lived about 10 hours upriver in one of their mandioca farms, dividing their time between crop harvesting, fishing, and farinha toasting. As we approached the farm, we first saw 2 canoes, one loaded with bananas, plantain, and cassava, the other half immersed and full of peeled yellow cassava roots. Omari did not say anything, but I could see how intrigued she was. We disembarked. Armenia's dad and mom greeted us. The mom took us to one of her plantations. I estimated the oldest plants to be about 2 or 3 months old. Armenia found small, slim branches on the ground, which he divided into cuttings to show Omari how people plant manioc in this part of the Amazon. I don't remember the full conversation between the two of them, but I will never forget Omari's look of utter surprise and total incredulity when Armenia told her that the roots were poisonous. This was a plantation of mandioca, not macaxeira. Omari's first reaction was to dig a tuberous root out, scratch the skin, and put it in her mouth to test whether this was true. Armenia shouted, horrified, "Don't do that! You'll fall ill, gravely so. You might die." Omari did not challenge her further, but she clearly did not believe a word of what she was told. I intervened and explained to her, half in Spanish, half in Guarani, that this was a different sort of yuca, of manioc, yuca amarga, bitter manioc, not the one she grew back home. This kind had to be prepared very differently. It was not sweet, and it could never be eaten raw. The bitter poison had to be expressed either through immersion in water or through mechanical removal. She was still visibly unconvinced. We continued the visit and reached the Casa de Farinha, the open-air kitchen where mandioca was stored and processed into flour. There, Omari had another shock. She had never seen such quantities of roots being harvested at once, piled into a giant heap in one corner. She exchanged a few animated words in Warani with Moy, my brother like Toniaka Bain. He was as intrigued as Omari by the size and quantity of manioc roots in the tambo. More, he was suspicious. Armenia conversed with her parents and then addressed herself to her Warani visitors, speaking in slow Portuguese for them to better catch what she was saying. I helped by translating into Spanish and some Warani as well. Armenia's mother sang a song in an indigenous language. What the Ribereño old couple wanted to tell their Guarani visitors is that their own parents or perhaps grandparents had learned how to grow mandioca and prepare farinha from native Amazonians during the rubber era. In other words, they had learned from people not that different from Moy and Omari, but native to this part of Brazil, who spoke their own language and who had their own way to grow and process manioc. These native Amazonians had taught the newcomers how to live well here in the Rio Negro watershed, how to grow crops, and how to cook food. They also taught them songs and stories, including the song we had just heard. Armenia added that her family was very grateful to the Indios for all their teaching. I don't remember Omari and Moy asking any question to find out more about the technical aspect of farinha processing. We sat in silence for a while. Omari offered to join in peeling the roots. I wish today I had paid more attention to what happened during that afternoon. As I am writing this, it occurs to me that there may be some connection between our 2009 trip to the Rio Negro and an incident that occurred in 2013, 4 years later. A period of upheaval and commotion had followed on from the sudden deaths of Ompure and Bouguenais, two Warani elders spare killed in early March 2013 by warriors from a group of uncontacted Warani known as Tarumenani. As a respected leader, the president of the Warani Women's Association, and a member of a powerful evangelical mission, Omari was directly involved in intense peace talks with the relatives of the deceased from Easter 2013 to at least the end of 2014. It is during that time that she contacted me and asked for help. She wanted me to find funding for what, in her view, was the only way to create sustained peace with the Tarumenani, to create a giant manioc plantation at the heart of the Warani territory that would feed the hidden ones. Not being in Ecuador at the time, I was unable to understand with sufficient depth what she had in mind. I confess to puzzlement, skepticism, and even suspicion as to where this idea came from. Unsure of the cultural appropriateness of the project, or for that matter, of its realizability, I also wondered how widespread among the Warani the wish expressed by Omari was. It never occurred to me at the time that her exposure to Ribeniero mandioca abundance may have played a role in her imagining this peace solution. So that is really at the heart of what my story is about. You see, a new kind of ethnography in a way. When you work for a very long time in a place, I'm sure that every ethnographer has this kind of experience. You haven't got the field notes, but you've taken pictures, and this is where these audiovisual, you know, aids are very useful. I took so many pictures on that trip, and Mui as well, actually. And so, without the pictures, I would not have remembered so much. The pictures triggered my memory, and not the written words. Um, So, but then also I had a lot of archived materials about the GTA ESPA workshop. So it was very much, this typical kind of meetings that so many of them have taken place in the last 30 years or so, between indigenous communities, NGOs, funders, donors, academics who are trying to create new grants to support these, et cetera, et cetera. And, that GTA meeting for me was, I had dreamt of organizing a meeting for so long. Honestly, for me, since I was a very young anthropologist, having indigenous people meeting each other across cultural boundaries, especially country boundaries, had always been my dream. But it's very expensive. It was very hard to sell to the donors. We didn't see the interest of doing that, at least at the time. I'm talking back in the 1990s and the early 2000s. But then we had money, and it was really so, it was just the beginning of the global challenges, the idea of SDGs and all these kind of UN imaginaries of a new form of sustainable development, and there was money for that. And honestly, it was the most beautiful experience of my life. It lasted about a week, and I have a lot of pictures as well of the meeting. And we met in an agroecological center on the outskirts of Manaus, which was trying to demonstrate how the Amazon could be developed sustainably, with using nature-based solution, as we are called today. Um, and all these methods, that don't rely on AI and, all this kind of frontier of technology that is taking us more into the transhuman, and the outer space and all of that. And, we had enough money to invite people from all the leaders we knew, all the friends we knew, the people we really cared about, so they could speak to each other. And so that's the context in which, this meeting took place. And obviously, during the meeting, I was not a direct co-organizer of it, but I was very involved in the co-organizing because we were trying to get money, to create a big grant, to work on these issues in a pan-Amazonian way rather than country by country. And so I was very focused on, the debates on, how we are going to frame the second grant. We are competing on a very high level with the British official aid, and it's very, very difficult to get these grants, right? And so it never occurred to me at the time to think about how we, Omari and the other leaders I knew I invited who kindly came to the meeting, from Guyana, from Peru, from Bolivia, how they experienced this, what it meant for them to be in this place for a week. What did they make of it? I never really thought about that at the time, right? So, um, and then, let me see. And then that trip was completely improvised. We had not thought about going to the Rio Negro, but then that opportunity came, and we were, it was a very wonderful opportunity. And so it's that kind of serendipity that is so important in anthropological research, right? But then when I was writing that, I realized as well, these issues of why people are visiting each other, what are they trying to convey, what they are making of it. It was happening to Omari and Armenia in the particular scene that I was describing. They have to communicate across a lot of language barriers, languages that are not just, Portuguese and Spanish, for example, but also languages of conservation, of mapping, of growing food. I mean, so many different ways of framing reality, if you wish. And, there was a new kind of intercultural communication going in there. And I realized that, they were really trying to understand each other. They had their own, they were not doing it as an ethnographer would do, but they were navigating around these vocabularies, if for me, as I say, in the next section of the paper all the epistemological problems I was encountering writing this between classifications and categorization. How do you call these people? Armenia's family, caboclos, ribenieros, I mean, Robert Tapper's descendants. I mean, how do you call them? Peasants. All these vocabularies really stood in the way, and even the Warani, how do you talk about them unless you call them Warani? And then the different kinds of crops as well, and then the different kinds of cultivated space. What is the difference between a garden, a field, a plantation? Are we using these terms in as synonyms so that our text is not so boring to read? And then the different kinds of processing and techniques that are at play, because certain indigenous terms become normalized within Portuguese and others become normalized in Spanish. And then when you try to bring the two together, what kind of generic ethic, if you wish, anthropological vocabulary do you develop on top of that? But, Mary and Armenia had to do the same thing. They had to work hard to find out, but to go over these botanical and sociological categories in order to communicate about their respective communities' perspectives on manioc. And they really wanted to do that. Armenia really wanted Omari to visit her parents. She really wanted her to see how people were cultivating in that part of the Amazon. Yuca and manioc are terms used in Spanish-speaking parts of Amazonia, while cassava tends to be used in Brazilian Portuguese, a language in which it is further differentiated into sweet varieties and bitter ones. Manioc varieties have traveled unevenly through space and time, and so have ways of naming them. The lopsided cooptation of some indigenous terms now used as labels for generic categories means that in Brazil, the term cassava tends to lump together bitter varieties from which a whole range of foods are made, in particular farinha de mandioca, farinha for short, toasted manioc flour, manioc meal if you translate into English, and beiju, flat unleavened bread made either from grated manioc, manioc starch, or a mixture of the two ingredients. The Spanish spelling farinha is sometimes used as well. The term ribereños, river dwellers, refers to rural peasant populations made up of indigenous and non-indigenous backgrounds, in whose tambos, dwellings, or compounds, the flower house Casa de Farinha figures prominently. The term caboclos has fallen in disuse due to its derogatory connotations of backwardness. Many caboclos settled in the Amazon region after the end of the rubber boom as small-scale independent rubber tappers are also known as seringueros, representatives of their extractivist social movements were present at the Manaus GTR-sponsored international workshop. And for me, it was my very first time encountering all of this during that trip. Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to read too long. So, but in the following section, I describe again very ethnographically what is happening in the flower house and the surprise of my Warani friends of seeing that completely different manioc being processed in completely different way and really not understanding very much of what was going on. But, joining in and, they are not voicing their questions. They are not like these Western ethnographer just, burdening people with questions. They don't question, but they observe very intensely. They take on board. They try to understand without asking questions, which I find very fascinating as well. When you start writing it, you realize that there is a lot there that we need to still think about. Right. And so that takes me to yes, to the importance of food, and how basically it's when you start separating an ethnography of cultivation from an ethnography of food processing that you get into big trouble to really understand these indigenous ways of lives. Yeah. Um, and so, um, right, let me see. I don't want to read too much. I'm trying to see where I'm going next. But there is no doubt that I can see how my question arose in my mind that now that I'm reading this and I'm rethinking about, trying to link 2009 and 2014, 5 years apart, and having that hypothesis, are these two experiences connected um, in the political action or in the policy recommendation, depending on how you want to call it, that Omari came to? And I could speculate about that. But the great thing with long-term fieldwork is that you don't have to speculate on your own. You can call to your friends and ask them and present them with your conundrum and saying, what do you think of my interpretation? Do you think that there is something there or not? Yeah. And this is what the paper is all about, if you wish. It is to present my hypothesis to Omari and see what she thinks of it. Yeah. So almost 5 years after our trip to Armenia's community, Omari called. She had become a Warani spokesperson. So in that part of the paper, I'm doing it quite recursively. I go back to the event, but with a slightly different narration of it. Um, and I'm discovering again what she meant by this. "Nie, nie, 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 Kewan Kore." No, no. What did it meant? How did she envisage it? How did she had it in her mind? Yeah. Um, from one FaceTime conversation to the next, the exact location of the large manioc field moved slightly, though presumably reflecting ongoing negotiations with various actors, Wari and Kori alike. I puzzled over the request. What my help would consist of wasn't clear. Why and how a giant plantation would help re-establish peaceful exchanges between Taromenani, Warani, and Kori. Was it really what the Warani were asking for? Manure gardens that could freely and safely raid when in need? How would Moy and other male leaders bent on waging war against encroachers to monitor Ome, our land, our territory, react to this? Wasn't this vision of peace particularly Christian? What and who was behind this intensification project? And more pragmatically, who would make and maintain the Nangi Nangi Kewenkori? Perhaps what Omari simply needed at this stage was to brainstorm ideas with friendly foreigners like me. So what I'm trying to do, I suppose, in the paper is to revisit my skepticism. And, it's so often that we white researchers, white activists, etc., we have almost like an ambivalent relationship to the ideas of our indigenous co-researchers. We are always worried that they are being tainted by our words, as it were. And so when they present to us something new, something like exactly what Omari was saying, like, it's there is it's that reaction that I'm trying to really understand. Why is it that there is this skepticism? And also, I didn't really understand. That's the whole point. I didn't really understand what she was saying because communication is not so easy, and it takes time. And when you are trying to phone people like this, long distance, it's not easy to really understand the ideas that are being communicated to you. That's another part of it. So it is by phoning Omari again, so that 10 years on, 10 years on, phoning her on. And explaining her my dilemma, and that, she we could have a proper conversation. There was much more symmetry then, that I could see that, yes, there was a link between the two. There was a link that, there was an inspiration there that made her think as well differently about what could be done. Yeah. Um, and so, um, read page 20. Okay, let me read you a little passage of that. Um, Respect for the forest world not only animates Omari's expensive plan for the Taromenani, it also feeds into her art. A cultural logic other than one structured by resource ownership and labor mobilization animates the bioeconomy she contributes to create. Like a future-oriented interest in manioc for this involuntary isolation, her Chambira work is driven by a desire to maintain good relations with distant others. She weaves together polymorphic spatio-temporal transformations from the past with those that have yet to occur or that need to occur. So what I find really interesting in all that I find it deeply satisfying, is that I can see I have evolved, I have changed, I can recognize when I make mistakes, thank God, it's very important. But we are changing, and she changed. I mean, in those 10 years, she has learned so much more from the outside world as well. She's been involved in all kinds of things. And, you know, all that, all this maturity, if you want to call it that way, allows us to maybe communicate on a different level as well, or to see things that we were not being able to see before, and bring it bringing it together allows me, the anthropologist, to think about people and manioc in Amazonia historically in a different way. Yeah? And I would never have had the guts to write about it without that more personal intersubjective experience. But also, there are two additional factors. The first one, um, is that I started to work more in Brazil, in those years, from 2010 onwards. So I got to understand better, the kind of middle Amazon, especially, which is still, I mean, there is so much more to do. It's a crucial region for the history of the Amazon. We know that, but there is so much work now produced by so many fantastic ethnographers, and we need to bring that a little bit more together. But it's really when, for the first time, I had a proper time to visit the Tres Fronteras, between Iquitos, Santa Rosa, Leticia Tabaquinga, and Manaus. So you have Iquitos, Manaus, and in the middle, these communities that are growing. Um, and exchanging more and more between them. And I have quite a number of students now who've done fieldwork there. So I have a much better sense of what is going on. And I can see how the history needs to be written about the Amazon region from the mouth of the river, to the estuary on at the sea, right? But also, one of my finishing PhD student, Theodore Bormann, has done some fantastic work recently with the Yagua, who are just at the border of Peru and Colombia. And it's thanks to his work and me going and visiting him in the field that I got a better understanding, of the dynamism of the indigenous communities that live in this area of the Amazon. Yeah. Okay. So, um, how to theorize about that? So, um, it allowed me to link back to, the kind of anthropology that informed my student years, um, Robert Murphy, the Munduruku, and it was a pleasure to reread, his ethnography in the 1950s and try to interpret it differently, showing that that's what good ethnography is. So I want you to do the same with mine, hopefully. That he wasn't theorizing at all about the role of Farinia in the book, in his monograph in any way, but it is there and you can demonstrate that. Yeah. Um, And so, how Farinia was such an important item of exchange, for these communities in the colonial times. Huh? And so that brings me to, the remark page, just at the end of that section 5, before 5.1. There is little doubt that Manio Esculenta's extraordinary biological plasticity has allowed people to develop an impressive diversity of agri-food systems in the Amazon rainforest and in rural areas of Brazil that were once upon a time covered with Mata Atlantica. This is what also I found so exciting, um, doing the research for this paper is, the ancestors of Armenia who came from the northeast, they were cultivating manioc as well, almost certainly. True, such flexibility and adaptability allowed indigenous people from the Rio Negro to share the arts of farina making with Armenia's forebears. But it is the mental intertwining of Armenia's farina making with Mandioca's bitter agency that opened Omari's mind to new Warani ways of thinking about manioc as a crop that is best left escaped in the forest. It follows that Amazonian crop domestication must be approached in ways that reconnect cultivation and food processing, self-sufficiency and intensification, beer brewing and farina making. Moreover, to contribute more directly to interdisciplinary research on manioc, ethnographic writing needs to deal more systematically with changing consumption preferences and evolving commercial pressures. And I have this beautiful doctoral student, Yu Yi, she who is doing that with the tikuna, not very far from Laetitia, and it works so well. She's worked a brilliant methodology to talk about the agro-food system in a way that shows the dynamism of these indigenous knowledge systems. To illustrate the historical importance of farina making in Amazonia, I revisit below a classic anthropological text on native Amazonians during the rubber era. I then discuss the continuing relevance of farina making in rural Brazil today. By bringing the two analytical moments together, I hope to shed new light on the active production of cultural continuity. So I don't want to speak too long. I'm going to bring that to a close very soon. I'm not going to read, obviously, these two sections, but I'm very interested in the fact that there are a lot of new anthropologists and ethnographers who are trying to think about this Casa de Farinha using multi-species, approaches, new materiality approaches, and I can see, the benefits of doing that. And as I was saying earlier on, I'm trying to connect that with the benefits of doing this kind of traditional social anthropology, that interface between anthropology and history, which was very characteristic from the anthropology I learned as a student in the 1980s. And I tried to practice as a field worker in the 1990s and the 2000s. So I'm just going to read the conclusion now. To what extent is history a multi-species affair? As mentioned in the introduction, much of my career has been spent documenting key aspects of plant and landscape domestication in the parts of Amazonia where I have conducted fieldwork. An early contributor to the historical ecology framework, which emphasizes historical processes while rejecting environmental determinist approaches, such as the optimal foraging theory, I have long been concerned with the ways in which Amazonian forest societies transform as they modify their surroundings. We now have much greater understanding of the processes that led to the anthropization of the Amazon biome. The research on Amazonia's 8,000 years of biocultural history, with its focus on the eco-evolutionary origins of crop domestication and their pre-Columbian pathways, has done much to counter the push of commodity frontiers ever deeper into the tropical rainforest, especially Brazil. This is crucial given that deeply flawed theories about agrarian transformation are still used to justify such penetration. However, when widely popularized in the media, Such narratives and theories do little to counter the new capitalist spirits of might is right. By becoming increasingly detached from the life experiences of historical actors, such as Omari, Armenia, or the Seringueros I met during the GTA-sponsored workshop, they may even disempower current struggles for justice and sustainability. I propose, therefore, that we turn our attention to what happened in the biome over the 19th and the 20th century. Inevitably, the rubber era will stand out as a long historical cycle that has shaped, directly or indirectly, the agri-food systems in which manioc continues to be cultivated as main food crop. In so doing, however, we must avoid attributing too much multi-species other than human agency to manioc or to rubber. Whereas manioc is a food crop with a history of domestication thousands of years old, rubber was domesticated in a haste as a plantationable industrial crop with little edible value in the last decades of the 19th century. Of course, new analytical sensibilities would expect us to examine manioc and rubber from the perspective of plant animacy, without which we are reminded human life would be impossible. A multi-species anthropologist would approach manioc and rubber relationally, that is, as ongoing life projects resulting from reactivated relations. Would that make us lose sight of what matters for Armenia, of what is significant for Omari? True, a biosocial lens on crop cultivation need not detract us from approaching the past as remembered and memorized. However, paying focused attention to contrastive forms of collective world-making, as I have endeavored to do in this article, requires approaching history as a conscious, intersubjective process that travels along cross, trans, and intercultural exchanges. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Laura, y muchas gracias a todos y a todas por haber estado en esta sesión.
Thank you, Laura, for coming and for participating, and thanks everyone for being here. We'll continue with our cycle of talks next semester. They're already to announced on the ECHO website, so we hope to see you again soon. Thanks again, Laura, for a fascinating talk.
Wapuni Rawa. Goodbye to everyone.